I've always loved this idea that on podcasts there's this kind of like a conceptual barrier when somebody says the podcast starts now, and you hit a record button, and then we all become different people and we talk, like in a different way, like I put my podcast voice. And I think something like that happens kind of sort of quite often.
Well, look, let's just, this is the podcast that started then. We're going to mix things.
Oh my God, I put my podcast voice.
This can just be the podcast. So do you want to introduce who you are and why you're here?
Yes, I am Nick Shackleton-Jones, and I am Director of Learning Performance Innovation at PA Consulting. I'm here because you invited me on the show, and I've always enjoyed the show, and I've always enjoyed chatting with you folks, so that's why I'm here.
You've also released a book.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So there is which is very good, and we'll get into it. And because we've done a slightly weird start to this show, I'll just say that I'm Ross Garner, I'm hosting, and Owen's here as well. Hello, Owen.
Hello.
Are you going with this new format? It's a bit weird.
What new format?
Like this that we've just started.
It was like a cold open, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. Hello. It's a good, slightly sort of French kind of,
jazz podcasting.
Yeah, it is quite jazz. So, Nick, do you want to tell us what your book is called and what it's about?
Yes. Well, I got a copy of it to hand. I think it's called How People Learn, Designing Education and Training That Works, something like that.
That works to improve performance.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
There's something really interesting about that title, but I'll come back to that.
I was going to say, Nick, did you choose the tagline?
No. So I think...
No.
I wondered this as well.
It's
keyword optimized.
Yes, it is. Keyword optimized. So I chose the main title, which is How People Learn. And then I think the publishers were, because the publishers is kind of like a marketing organization, and they are, as you say, kind of trying to target a certain section of the population. And I think their view was, look, you've got to tell people that this is going to be a very practical book. It's going to tell them how to do something that improves something in the business. So we kind of negotiated a subtitle, but that was kind of very much their kind of direction, whereas the main title was my direction. And they reflect, if you read the book, different kinds of direction and influences in it. But they do link together.
Because my impression reading the book is that you do not care for education or training. And so it was odd to see in the subtitle, Designing Education and Training.
Yeah, I don't care for it as it is today, but my aspiration is to fix it, to make education learning. I think the thrust of what I'm saying is that education has drifted away from learning. In fact, now, more often than not, education gets in the way of learning. It stops people learning. In a very kind of literal sense. And that's horrible. And it's become this kind of weird set of rituals which bear very little relation whatsoever to kind of learning, and are more closely akin to something you might describe as kind of torture. And we just got to stop it. It's just getting worse and worse. And we're drugging people, we're brain damaging people now, literally. So if people don't fit in and conform, we used to beat them. So we used to whack them with sticks. Even in my day, as growing up, there were schools, where corporal punishment was the norm if you didn't conform. And now we just drug them. And this causes kind of long-term damage. So, yeah, I think we've got to stop it before it gets any worse.
So I think it might be worthwhile you giving us, telling us what you mean by learning. And the reason for that is that you're saying you want us to move away as a society from education to actual learning. But I think in common parlance, the two have in culture been combined. Like they're almost like, so when we speak to people and we use the word learning, they think education. That's what comes to mind when you talk about learning, which is one of the reasons why we advise people to not use the word learning, because most people think of it as something that is scheduled for them or happens outside of like their normal day-to-day lives.
Yeah. I'll give it a go. So I think you're absolutely right, and this is why I draw that distinction, because people have started to conflate the two terms, and that's the most frightening thing of all, because at the point at which people actually think they're the same thing, you've killed any opportunity for kind of the resurrection of learning under that name. You have to call it something completely different. And interestingly, with our industry, we're starting to see that happen, which is why sometimes we talk about performance support, we talk about experience design, because you're trying to resurrect learning by creating a different space, kind of different name. But you've asked a question which kind of warrants, I think, a deeper answer, which is, so I worked on kind of educational training type problems. They're basically the same thing. I've actually had clients say training is basically the same as education. You give people some facts and then they've got to do a test and you score that they completed the quiz. I worked on those sorts of problems for a long time, trying to figure out how to design more efficient training and so on. And what I realized time and time again was that you cannot answer these kinds of problems about how to design an efficient training course, about how to measure training effectively, about how to align training with business objectives until you really understand what learning is. You just got no hope of solving any of those problems without understanding learning. So that became my mission, to kind of go after learning. And I spent some time as a psychology lecturer. I'm fairly familiar with lots of kind of learning theory, instructional design. I eventually figured out it's crap. It is just mumbo jumbo. It's like people, they're searching a dark house and they've just pointed a torch in the wrong corner and they're cataloguing all kinds of bits of fluff, which is the example I use in a book. But they've yet to notice there's kind of a table and chairs in the middle of the room. So what learning really is it's an entirely separate process. And this is, I guess, the real thrust of the book, to introduce a general theory of learning, which we can use to understand human learning, animal learning, experimental, everyday kind of findings, using a unified framework. So learning is the encoding of our affective responses to what we experience. So we go through the world, and as Hebb in 1949 noticed, your neurons are wiring and kind of firing and rewiring as you go through the world and storing something. The question is, what are they storing? My answer is they're storing your affective reactions to things, and you use those reactions to kind of conjure up a memory, and that memory process underpins learning. So I'm going to kind of stop there because that probably raises some questions. So that's what learning is.
Yeah, I would imagine everyone at home is thinking, what are you talking about?
yeah, I'm sure they are, yeah.
So, where to begin? So first, I think education and training have fundamentally different purposes, particularly school education. And then there is also the what do you mean by an effective process or response? And are you saying that our memories don't exist? We just construct them on demand each time. So there's three questions there. Which do you want to go for first? It's a choose your own adventure.
I quite like that. So maybe let's start with the last kind of first. Am I saying you don't remember anything? So imagine that somebody's sort of explaining computers to you, and you're fairly familiar with computers because you played all these amazing first-person shooter games, as I have. And then they say, well, there's a really interesting thing about these computers is that they're binary. And you say, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that basically when they encode data, for example, on a hard drive, when they process data, the basic level is either ones and zeros. And you say, well, that's an incredible thought. All of this that I'm seeing on my screen at the most basic level is just combinations of ones and zeros. And you say, yeah. And so I'm saying something very similar about human beings, which is that the complexity of cognition, thinking, memory, decision-making are all, at a basic level, affective responses. So all of these things are subtle emotional reactions to things. And that's a crazy, incredible idea. And it is. It's just why I wrote a book. But there's lots and lots of support for it, both in terms of, what the neuroscience is telling us. So people like Damasio, and where is she? She's on the table here. Mary Helen Immordino Yang, Emotions, Learning in the Brain. Also people like
That's her book is on the table.
Yeah, my book's on the table. So yeah, so thanks for this application.
She's not on the table right here.
So this guy, Jaak Panksepp, Affective Neuroscience, if you want to read it. And basically what they discover is that from a neuroscientific perspective, thinking and emotion are integrated. They're the same sets of circuits in the mind. So on the one hand, this is what we find neurologically. On the other hand, if you then begin to apply that thinking to what we know from people like Elizabeth Loftus, or even kind of Ebbinghaus, what we see is that the emotional significance of information really drives the outcomes of their experiments. And so it has huge predictive power as well as a model. But I think I'm just going to finish by saying I understand that people are kind of blown away by the idea. I feel a little bit like the guy who tries to explain to people that the Earth is round, and everybody says, well, that's just nuts, you'd fall off. And it's kind of end of conversation. and so there's an awful lot that goes behind kind of persuading people that no, that actually is an explanation that makes more sense.
So there's a couple of things in there that I think are worth exploring. The idea that you construct your memories and responses to things on the fly is actually that's one of the kind of working theories in cognitive neuroscience. That I went on I did a MOOC because I'm weird, and it was it was interesting. But that was one of the key things that they talked about. They said like your response to things are literally constructed on the fly based on all this. They weren't talking about affective reactions, but they were essentially saying based on your memories. You're constructing your response to things. So you don't actually hold beliefs about things. You recreate that belief based on your memories. Every single time you're faced with a situation where that belief is important. But when you're talking about, I think what's interesting is when you're talking about affective response, you're talking about something much more subtle than simple emotions, love, hate, anger, etc.
Yeah,
and so
you're absolutely right. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so it's that. I think sometimes what gets lost when I see you debating people, is that they're thinking about affective responses. They're translating that. And they're just essentially saying it's emotion. It's how you feel about something, and you're saying no, it's much more granular than that.
You are absolutely right, and this is one of the big challenges. And I'm open to advice on how to get around it. Is that when you talk about emotion, people think about the very kind of crude order of emotions, which are, kind of love, hate, those sorts of things. And this has hampered progress in understanding cognition because there's no doubt in my mind, I suspect in your mind, that when you see people with different haircuts, for example, you have distinct emotional reactions to different haircuts. When you hear different sounds, and the example I use in the book is the sound of a bumblebee versus a mosquito, versus something else. There's no doubt in my mind that you have different emotional reactions to those things, but you couldn't characterize them in those kind of gross terms. But because of kind of Plato and Descartes and that whole kind of Western intellectual tradition, we've neglected the very basis of cognition, which are these very subtle emotional reactions that we have to what we experience. And there is some research around this. I use the Iowa gambling task as a kind of example of it. The implicit association test, I think, is also very interesting. But both of those suggest that we're actually encoding our emotional reactions to things in a way which we're not necessarily conscious of. But because we've never really explored that idea, we simply don't have the language for it.
I think that is, if I'm going to pick not a facetious example, but it sounds like the way that you talk about it is that learning is the same as remembering stuff, or possibly having some sort of like fight or flight response to things. I think about like I was learning the fiddle for a while. I would say I'm still learning the fiddle, but I haven't touched it in several months. And I am amazed, but when I pick it up, I couldn't tell you what the notes were, and even if I had the sheet music in front of me, I cannot play music looking at a tune that I have learned. But sometimes I'll just be able to play it without thinking about it. Where does emotion come into that kind of learning? Because we would call it muscle memory casually. So where's the affective response there?
So I guess I would. It was an unusual kind of choice of words like fight or flight. That's I guess not what I mean at all. And you're certainly right that I'm not.
I think it was the mosquito example.
Yeah. But I'm certainly not suggesting that remembering and learning are the same. But what I would say is that memory is a prerequisite for learning. So you can't learn if the memory doesn't exist. So I think memory, the way I define it, is a change in behavior or capability as a result of memory. So you might remember something, but it might not, change your behavior or capability in any way, in which case I think we say you haven't learned. I think there are some challenges around kind of muscle memory, because I think muscle memory is something which is kind of more instinctive. But I think that all learning, including instinctive learning, is shaped by this single affective process. And that extends all the way back to homeostasis. So at the risk of sort of sounding quasi-technical, this is the argument and the line that kind of Damasio takes, which is we are creatures, much like any other creature, that are basically designed to optimize our kind of conditions for living. And if you imagine a kind of a very primitive creature, the way that it does that is it encounters kind of bad environments and it wants to avoid those in future. How are you going to do that? Well, it kind of helps if that environment triggers an internal reaction that you recognize. So you think, oh my God, I'm here and this was really bad last time. So his point is that all of learning is kind of worked up from that basis, from all the way up to kind of, as I say, your choice of smartphone. It just becomes an elaboration of those kind of emotional reactions. So I think that in the case of learning to play basketball, then some of those things are just learned through the reaction that you have time and time again or to the things that you do. So you do something that has a positive or negative, and gradually those become reinforced through that process. So you play the piano, you get something wrong. How do you feel? Frustrated, I guess. Yeah. There might even be somebody sitting next to you who kind of ticks you off at that point. And those steer your learning through that process, through the process of internalized affective responses or external ones. So I think the other example you gave, I think, is in some ways more interesting, which is you asked about a car mechanic. Is that right?
Yeah, so when I was sending some questions through in advance, I was asking how would the affective context model explain how a mechanic learns how to fix a car, or how someone in a call center learns to handle customer complaints?
Yeah. I think in some ways that's even more interesting because there's more of a social dimension to it. And I think people are quite social creatures. You could conceivably learn to play the violin or whatever in a room on your own, and then it's just your own affective responses. But I think in the case of a car mechanic, some really interesting things happen there, which is in some ways a better bridge to what we do in kind of L&D. So the first thing is that a new car mechanic, you would hear stories from people. So they would tell you stories about why you shouldn't do this or why, somebody did that. And I think stories have always been fantastically effective as ways of conveying learning. In fact, Kate Fox, who's an anthropologist, found that they're somewhere between kind of 2/3 and 80% of the way that we communicate normally. And that's an incredible thing, something we've just completely overlooked, that stories are the essence of how we kind of convey learning quite naturally. So stories are a big part of it, and stories carry affective significance. They always do. That's what makes them stories. Observational learning. So you'd probably watch people doing things, and their mirror neurons help us to immediately intuit how other people are feeling and the affective consequences of what they're doing. And then the final way is you'd probably practice and you'd learn a lot by doing.
So yeah, I'd like to come in on the observational point, because I think is your point that you can put yourself into the position of the person that you're watching. You can pick up that they are frustrated by certain things or they are satisfied when something goes right. You're having a sort of a empathetic emotional response to them.
Yeah, I mean, even chickens do something like that. So chickens can learn from observation. You can show a chicken a movie of another chicken, and it will learn from it. And one assumes it doesn't have a theory of mind, but a plausible affective context would be if something bad.
They want us to know about.
Yeah, something bad happened to the chicken in the movie. I love this whole idea of genre of chicken movies, but the chicken is watching a movie, identifies obviously with a hero chicken. Something horrible happens to the chicken in the movie, and it learns something as a consequence. And you've got to stop and think, well, how on earth is that happening? And I would suggest affective context model says, well, because it experiences directly, not through some complex cognitive process of putting yourself in a person's shoes, but it experiences quite directly through a system like mirror neurons what that other kind of individual is experiencing. So humans do this. This is kind of well established. You watch somebody suffering, you will quite often kind of actually literally wince yourself. And this process helps us to learn from others.
So first of all, I'd say I'm bought into this in principle. I think the way that you're describing things, the importance of how much people care about something, and the importance in thinking about how much effective response you need to generate in order to support people in the workplace is useful. But you're talking about this as a kind of general theory of learning. And so one of the things about good theories is that they explain current phenomena, but they're also predictive. So if I was to ask you and one of the things so if you think about some of the, sort of the great working theories, so you think about theory of relativity, for example, one of the things that Einstein did is he posited experiments that hadn't been conducted, but would verify his theory or not, right? So you need to have something that is testable as a result of it. So my question for you around that kind of stuff is, if you could conduct an experiment that would test this theory, what would it be?
Almost any experiment, because there's a good theory, it's true, it will predict the outcome accurately. It sounds like a quite sweeping statement, it is, but I can come up with any number. So here's a nice, simple one. Take Ebbinghouse's original experiment. And take a bunch of trigrams, K, F, P, or whatever.
Sorry, I'm going to stop you right away. Could you explain the experiment?
Yeah, sure, yeah. So
let's assume that everyone listening is not the same level of learning nerds.
I'd love to. So
you and Owen are.
No, I'm a terrible learning nerd. But that's the beauty of this. The affective context is that people who care about this stuff will listen to your podcast and remember some of these things. People who don't won't, and it's kind of simply as straightforward as that. I mean, that can be your experiment if you like. But so Ebbinghouse's experiment, 1885. He was an idiot, basically. He was seduced by a trendy new approach called psychophysics, and he was trying to investigate a pure stimulus because he was, hooked on this rationalist tradition. And he didn't want people's kind of context or pesky personal experience to kind of get in the way of studying remembering. So he invented a kind of neutral stimulus, which is trigrams, which are three-letter combinations like X, T, F or something. And if you're a participant in this experiment, you'd be given a list of these trigrams and told to try and remember them. And of course, what he discovered is that people can't remember them very well. And he came up with something called the forgetting curve. The obvious conclusion from this experiment is that personal significance, is clearly integral to the process of remembering. That's the only sensible conclusion. If you give people a bunch of garbage and they forget it all immediately, that's a conclusion you should draw. Imagine you investigating digestion. You gave people glass beads and you notice that they just pass straight through the system. Wouldn't you just conclude that people don't digest glass beads? What you probably wouldn't do is to force them to eat them over and over and over again until they retain some of them. But sadly, this is exactly what Ebbinghaus did, and it kind of gave birth to rote learning and all kinds of horrible, brutal things. But in answer to your question, Owen, a simple thing that you could do is to introduce some real words into that list of trigrams. So instead of XFP, how about a word TOY, toy, or God, or war, or anything else with effective significance, and see which ones people remember. And I can tell you right now, with high degree of confidence, because I've run the experiment, you run it on your kids, that they will remember very few of the meaningless trigrams and very many more of the meaningful trigrams. And simple prediction. Now, the point you would make, I would make it if I was your shoes, there are a number of explanations of why that could be the case. Okay, fine. But we now then need to look at some different contexts. And there's another experiment which has actually been run, which is a good test of the effective context model, Bauer and Clark, which I cite in the book. Gave two independent measures designed, two groups of people, words to remember. One group had to make them into a story. And what Bauer and Clark found was that making words into a story, in other words, adding effective significance, increased retention sevenfold. Sevenfold. That is probably the biggest experimental result that you'll come across in any of the kind of research around sort of learning and memory. And yet, what do we do with stories and learning? Is that the very heart, the very centerpiece of how we do education, stories? No. It's barely kind of covered in instructional design. And yet it's the most significant effect. And it's again because this has been staring us in the face. Throughout human history, people tell stories. They still tell stories. We go to movies to watch stories. And yet We just it hasn't fitted with our model of how we think human beings should work. And so we pretty much ignored it. But yes, we can come out with any number of experiments. There's just kind of two off the top of my head. The other experiment, which is a real one.
If I was going to be unkind,
if
I was going to be unkind, Owen asked you for experiments that the model would predict the outcome. You cited two that you based your model on. It's a slightly circular argument.
Oh no, the experiment with the mixing up the words hasn't, actually been done. Except I've done it kind of, just for myself and the kids. But yeah, that's one that you could do quite easily.
Okay, I'll let you off.
Yeah. Thanks. I think there's an interesting point behind that, though. I'm not paid to be a researcher, but the experiments that I base on the affective context model are real life ones. So every program that we design, we base kind of on this kind of thinking. So some of the work we did at BP for sure. And we saw dramatic effects, unprecedented levels of effects, and shifting from a kind of an old model, kind of content dumping, to a kind of a user-centered model based around affective context. Yeah.
And I think, and that's one of the things that I like about the book, is that you get the sort of theoretical underpinnings, and then what you also do is you provide some practical tools that people can use to apply it in practice in the workplace. So do you want to talk about how a learning practitioner would take all this stuff about affective context and care, etc., and actually start applying it to their day-to-day practice?
Yeah, I guess I do and I don't, because I suppose I've seen that a lot of learning.
You want people to buy the book?
I don't mind in a way. My key driver was to understand this stuff, and I think I've understood that some people are interested in understanding it, and some people aren't, and so in a sense, there will always be a kind of a group of people who just want to know how to apply it, as you say, Owen, and there'll be people who are passionate about really understanding it, and they might be different groups. So I think the book is a bit of both. But if I give a really kind of straightforward answer to your question, how do you take this and make use of it? Basically, affective context says, look, you find yourself always in one of two situations. Either when you talk to people, and you have to talk to people, you discover that they care about something, in which case create resources. And that's why we use Google. It never occurred to people that we never Google e-learning modules, or frankly anything with any instructional design in it. Because when you care about something, you have the affective context. This stuff matters. And you're quite happy with a bit of text or a checklist or a guide or whatever it is on Google or YouTube. And then the other context that you sometimes discover is when people don't care about things. And that's often the case in education, or, in corporate education, where you're trying to get people to care about safety or GDPR or something like that. And in those cases, you've got to add affective significance. And you can do that a whole host of ways. You can do it through storytelling, so a powerful way. You can do it through first-hand experience, so simulations and scenarios. But there are basically two fundamentally different jobs and kinds of work that you're doing. And some learning professionals may choose to focus just on one, so just kind of resources and performance support, performance guidance. And others may focus more on experience design. And some may do both. But I think that's the practical implication.
I think my only problem with what you said is that it's not true, that people don't Google e-learning. And I think an obvious example is Code Academy. And Owen, I think, might talk about Pluralsight later on. It kind of depends on how you define e-learning. But, Code Academy is one where it'll teach you over a number of weeks, however long you want. You can go at your own pace, how to code in a variety of languages, and it gives you immediate feedback, and you can see if it's working or not. Yes, there is definitely an emotional component to that, because it is satisfying when you see it work. You get that coder endorphin rush. But it's also a great example of instructional design, which I think you've called bullshit in the book.
Yes, yeah, I said it's mumbo jumbo. Yeah, I think it's right. I absolutely think it's mumbo jumbo. I think, and Code Academy is a brilliant example. I think it totally supports my argument in the face of what you're saying, because I've been to Code Academy and I've used it. And interestingly, it's nothing like any of the e-learning. I've spent 15 years kind of developing e-learning. It's actually a series of many challenges. it's actually a series of scenarios. Can you do this? Can you do this? And you keep practicing and do it right, which is exactly what I say about experience design. You have to design kind of simulations and situations, scenarios which challenge you. The essence of experience design is usually kind of creating challenges. So Code Academy is pretty good, but it's nothing like e-learning. And
it depends what you mean by e-learning. I'm not going to let this one go.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, I think, if you, I think, so when you say e-learning, Nick, what do you mean?
Yeah. Here's the fun thing. We don't get to define the word. I discovered this kind of the hard way working at BP is we would interview young people, what sometimes called millennials, because we needed to find out, what was their preferred learning format. We said to them, as people like Jane Hart have done for decades, what do you think of e-learning? And they would say, it sucks. We hate it. It's just kind of cheap compliance stuff. And then we would say, oh, but, don't you use Google and YouTube? And they would say, yeah, but, it's not e-learning. And I think there are lots of learning professionals who would love to say, because it's all part of the rationalization of our industry, that Google and YouTube and kind of we can claim them as our own. What next? VR? We can just say that PS4 games are e-learning. They're not. And e-learning, typically we could come up with a detailed definition, but it's that kind of click next type stuff, which is based on a body of kind of instructional, received wisdom around instructional design, and more broadly on the knowledge transfer paradigm, the idea that e-learning is a format where you kind of put the learning objectives and the content into the course, and through a series of kind of structured interactions, somebody knows more at the end. So that's a kind of a sort of loose and fast definition, but I think the right way to answer that question would not be for you and I to bat it around, but to actually go to our audience and say, is this e-learning or isn't it? And they'll tell us.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with that entirely. But I think but our audience, people listening to this, probably mostly are people working in learning and development. And I think when you for example, so we produce e-learning. I would describe it to a layperson as it's an interactive web page. Effectively, it's a web page with some interactive components. It's exactly what you get if you go onto a good site via Google, and how we go about constructing those web pages is in partnership with the end users. And interestingly, on one of our products, which is a bunch of useful resources, right? It's useful stuff and checklists and how-to guides and all the rest of it. It gets heavily used. But the kind of content that outperforms the most, in that there's the fewest number of elements in there, but it gets used disproportionately well compared to the number of items that are in there, is the e-learning. It's those interactive web pages. And so how does that marry up? I'm wondering
if I could jump in.
I mean,
just because I worked on those, and I hate that I'm about to back up everything Nick has said so far. But those e-learning courses are typically not based on knowledge transfer. They have sort of stories and cartoons and poetry in them, and there's kind of mini challenges throughout. It's probably not the kind of here's 20 things to remember that Nick's talking about. It's actually, you would think we'd read Nick's book with the level of affective context influence on there.
Yeah, I guess, and what I found talking to learning professionals is I sometimes sound kind of overly critical, but the reality is that many people in teaching, or whether it's in education, intuitively kind of get all this stuff. So they get that if you want to have a really big impact on a student, you don't do that by ramming more information down their throat. You do that by demonstrating that you care, by inspiring them, by supporting them. I quite often hear those sorts of stories on the radio from people who say, thank you so much to my teacher, But when you listen to those stories, they will always say things like, they really cared about me, I felt they treated me as a person, they understood what mattered to me, they inspired me. And these are all affective dimensions of the process. And so good teachers and good educators, they intuitively get this. They just haven't had a proper framework. So there's a sadness about this all. It's had to happen kind of subversively and intuitively and against, the the grain, I guess, of the convention, and in the face of the curriculum. And I think that's a tremendous shame, and I think we can change it. But yeah, when I look at people developing learning content, the stuff that works best invariably falls into one of those two categories. It's either something which is kind of challenging and has strong affective dimensions. So you can think of some, there was a first aid one about doing CPR, I think with Vinnie Jones, Staying Alive, I think it was called, Bee Gees. People love to quote that as an example of e-learning. But everything that makes that work is effective. And then there's the other category where a lot of our work has been done, and you referred to it, Owen, as well, which is just useful stuff. And there's no problem with creating useful stuff for people. The reason that we're having this sort of to and froing over kind of e-learning is because you a bit like me, I think, have worked in that industry for a while. And you've got this sort of emotional attachment to the word e-learning, and we want it to be something else. And I get that we want it to be something that it isn't. But the problem is we've kind of trashed the term. And any time you say to a learner e-learning, they know exactly what you mean. They know that you mean some kind of dreadful HR compliance agenda. And I think part of my argument is like, it's dead, guys. Just move on. The kind of the Star Trek, it's dead, Jim. It's not coming back.
We are way over time for this one. And I have a staunch defence of the traditional education system that I would like to launch into, but I'm not going to, because now we're out of time. I'll tell you another time. Let's move on to what I learned this week, where we each share something we picked up over the past 7 days. Owen, can I implore you to go quickly?
Oh, you can implore me. I'm not sure if I can. Have I ever?
Try.
Sure. So we're trialing a new tool at GoodPractice in the software development team, and it's called Git Prime. And it basically gives you a series of metrics that highlight where there might be inefficiencies in how you're developing your software. And it's genuinely fascinating, and we're at the very early stages of using it. But it's amazing to me how an incredibly complex process, like developing a reasonably large piece of software and improving it, can be distilled into what I think are genuinely meaningful metrics that give both developers and managers an idea of like where we're going right and where we need to improve. But it did get me thinking that what makes this possible at all is that software developers in aggregate, as in the sort of the professional community, have settled on a small enough number of open standards that you can perform a rigorous analysis on what's happening. So how code changes are managed is reasonably standardized across 2 or 3 different standards. And what got me thinking about it is to what extent we can say that about other professions, right? So what would a Git Prime look like for managers or leaders, for example? Because I think we're so far away from agreeing on what the basic nuts and bolts of those roles are in any kind of rigorous way that would make it incredibly difficult. But I think it's a really interesting thing to think about, is if you can get something that requires as much creativity as software development, and it does, it's an incredibly creative process, but also have this kind of dashboard that gives you an insight into where you're going right and where you're going wrong. That would be a useful thing for someone to have. It's useful feedback. Anyway, there's a thing that got me thinking this week.
Software development also leaves a digital footprint, and it also requires standardization in a way that the general management stuff doesn't. Everyone can do their own thing, and the system will still work.
You say that, but like literally, these systems have been built up and developed over time. Like how you manage code changes, where the stuff that goes in, that stuff didn't exist 15 years ago. But now there's a small number of standards because they realized it was an important thing to start capturing. The digital footprint doesn't exist for some aspects of leadership management because we've not found a good way of capturing it.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting observation. It kind of chimes with what we found. A lot of my work's been leadership and management, and I think there's this contrast between this kind of highfalutin idea of leadership and management that you see on many courses. It's about style, it's about complex decision making and intuition, all this kind of stuff. the reality is that you can create performance guidance which effectively codifies what that looks like, I think in the way you're describing, if I understand you correctly, and that's way more effective. So it kind of actually boils down to kind of simple step-by-step guidance. And that's why I think it's kind of quite promising for AI and those kinds of applications, because it turns out a lot of it isn't actually that complicated. You can see a huge leap in leaders' performance if they just follow certain sort of simple steps. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree. It would be great to begin for different roles to codify actually what does performance look like. That's my spin, at least, on what you're saying, Owen.
Cool. Nick, what have you learned this week?
I think I learned something which I sort of had seen in presentations and are now seeing with the book, I think, which is you can give a presentation and you think you know what you're saying. Well, do you think you know what you're saying? Well, you kind of know what you're saying, I guess. And then afterwards, people thought you were saying something completely different. And I think I've also found that interesting to be true in the book, because I know what the book is about, but it seems that nobody else knows what the book is about. And so, or rather, different people think it's about different things. And I think that for me is kind of fascinating, and how you mediate and how everything becomes that kind of to and fro. So yeah.
Is that because they are creating their memory of the book based on their affective response to having read it on the fly?
That's a brilliant prediction. I mean, if only there was some way we could put that to the test. But I think that's exactly what's happening, is that certain things resonate, if we can use a kind of slightly soft and fluffy word, because we haven't got any decent words, with people, and that's kind of what they take away from it.
It sounds like reader response theory, not to drop back on my
scientist actually
English lit undergrad. But the act of reading is a creative act, and you bring a lot of your previous experience to that.
That sounds like a brilliant explanation. I'd like to know though, how is that previous experience encoded? When you say previous experience, what when you bring it, how do you bring it? What does that process look like? And that's why I would, push a little more and say, well, what is that?
Are you scientists getting in the way of us social scientist English lit graduates?
Yeah. How about you? What have you learned this week?
So I was thinking about skipping mine because we are short on time, but I'll go for it. So I was listening to Tim Harford on the TED Radio Hour, and he was talking about the London tube strike in 2014. And when this happened, a significant number of commuters had to find a new way to get to work because some of the routes were closed. And once the strike was over, 1 in 20 of them never went back to their original route. This had two benefits. So the first was that 1 in 20 people realized they'd been taking a suboptimal route through the subway network, and that there was an efficiency there. They could get to work faster or be less busy carriages and all these kind of things. But the other benefit was that the efficiency of the whole network improved because a fairly chunky number of people were moving through it faster, and that just improves the whole thing. So it was an argument for introducing difficulty into systems to see if people can be nudged into finding efficiencies.
That's also very interesting. I love that. There's a guy, Nassim Taleb, who's written a book called Anti-Fragility, and I know we're out of time, but it's just a conversation, I guess. And he writes that actually systems become fragile unless you expose them to kind of shocks. And that's how I would interpret that, is that a shock to that system actually improves the resilience kind of the system overall. And so it's interesting to think about engineered disruption, which then, from my perspective, connects back into kind of experience design and what we're trying to do there.
So one of the things that I noticed in the book, Nick, so you mentioned your tube map. And I did wonder, do you use a tube map or do you just use Google Maps?
I've got a tube map app. And I use it pretty much every day. And I can absolutely promise you that has pretty much eliminated my learning of the tube, because I don't know any routes. I barely know how to get from, Clapham Junction to Victoria, which is what I do every day, without the tube map. So it conceptually, I think that it just in itself challenges our perceptions of what we're doing when we create resources and performance support. Whether or not we actually believe that's encouraging learning or eliminating it, and whether or not we think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I stopped using a tube map because I just stick it into Google Maps and it tells me where to go, and I literally follow it all the time. The tube map is completely dead to me. It's been completely overridden by the Maps app on my phone that just tells me where to go and where to get off.
So that's quite disruptive for me. So I care about you. I respect you and what you think. So because of that, I will take advice. You're pushing, in essence, now in this conversation. You're saying, and that's quite disruptive. It's like, Nick, what you're doing is silly. There's a better way. No, I might actually try that now. And that might be the disruptive, push intervention, which causes me to shift my behavior. So yeah, I might give that a go and see how I get on with that.
I assume your comment, Owen, is prompted by the thought that anyone could possibly be taking a suboptimal route through the network, because surely they're all Googling it.
Yeah, well, no, I'm actually thinking, these people probably weren't using Google Maps, and therefore were to.
No, so the explanation from the original paper, I'll link to it in the show notes, could be extensive show notes today, was that the design of the tube map made some routes look shorter than they actually are.
Oh, right, okay, yeah, that's interesting.
This is going to be a nightmare edit. I asked people on Twitter what they had learned this week, and I got rakes of responses. So I'm just going to pick one, and I thought the most interesting one. Gemma Critchley learned why we have garden gnomes. And no, she wouldn't tell me. So if anyone's interested or knows, then let us know and we can look back on it. Thank you, Nick, for chatting with us today. I normally ask guests if they have anything to plug at this point. Do you? No, great. And thank you, Owen. You were fabulous as ever.
Thanks, guys.
Nick's book is available from Amazon, I believe, and also the Kogan Page website. I'll put some links in the show notes for that as well. If you want to get in touch with us about anything we've said, I'm on Twitter at RossGarnerGP in my podcast voice. Owen is
at Owen Ferguson,
and Nick is
at Shackleton-Jones.
Great. To find out more about Good Practice, including details of our resource-heavy performance support toolkit and our experience-tastic e-learning, visit goodpractice.com. Until next week, bye for now. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
But wait, don't go anywhere. We have exciting news, and Nicola Boyle from the Good Practice marketing team is here to tell us what that news is. Nicola, what's going on?
Hi, Ross. Yes, very exciting. We have a live podcast taking place on the 12th of June, so the evening of the first day of the Festival of Work.
Very exciting. It's going to be for our 3rd birthday party / 150th episode. So it's a big milestone for us, and we would love you to come. If you need any other reasons to come, though, Nicola, is there anything free that I might be able to consume whilst I'm there?
Yes, there will be some drinks and there will be some food as well.
I'm in. Sold. What time should I arrive?
We have drinks from 5:45 and the podcast will start at 6:30.
Oh, very exciting indeed. Do I need to bring anything to come to this event?
Yes, this is when you can bring along your what I learned this week.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to take part in the show, bring along something that you've learned that week, and we will be having a box mic that we'll be throwing around the room that you can catch and let us know what you've learned. Nicola, where can we get tickets for this exciting event?
So tickets will be available in the next week or so. So if you just look out on our social and you'll find out more then.
I'm excited. I can't wait for it to start. Are you excited?
I'm very excited too, Ross. Can't wait.